Well, hello there, and welcome back for another flip lesson done by me, Mr. Greving. So, obviously, I'm not going to try to spend too much time on this. There's going to be some other things I want you to look at, but I just wanted to kind of introduce mass migration to you. Now, I know you've kind of maybe read a little bit in your book about mass migrations, but because of its heavy weightiness that it is on the test, I wanted to make sure that we covered some ground here. So, mass migrations is referring to the migratory movements of large amounts of people, usually in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of different upheaval, people moving from rural to urban areas, but more important in terms of the test, people moving to various other places around the world. And there are a couple of different examples that you're going to look at beyond what I'm going to give you, but these are going to be some examples of mass migrations. So, generally, like the best example that we can kind of look to is just the various kinds of migrations that are relatively well known to us. These would be people from Europe moving to the Americas, specifically the United States, for my example, in an effort to find usually like a better life outside of the Industrial Revolution, or because of population growth. They're going to be forced out of specific areas. But regardless of circumstance, we're seeing a large number of Europeans moving and forming communities in the United States. So, whenever you look at migrations, you always have to think push and pull factors. And even when you're looking at migrations from this time period or from past time periods, you need to kind of consider why people are moving. So, here's a couple of different reasons why people probably moved to the United States from Europe. So the first thing you always have to look at is push factors, and we've talked about this before. Push factors are things that are forcing people out of an area. So this is like conditions are going so poorly in wherever they live that they feel like they need to leave. Like there are no opportunities for them. Any place is better than the place that they're in right now, and those are the things that they're kind of looking for. Push and pull factors sometimes do work together, because you have to have something that's strong enough to force someone out of an area and something strong enough to pull them to a particular area past that. So push factors could be anything from like poverty. So as many of these rural farmers' lives are destroyed by the Industrial Revolution and they're forced to move to urban environments, a push factor maybe is simply because they're thrust into poverty. They've lost their land, they've lost their income, and thus they maybe need to move to a more urban environment or to another place in the world in an effort to find more work. Also, it could just simply be population growth, right? Wages maybe drop because of the amount of people in a particular area. Or there's just not enough area to live in general. And so the excess population that's being created by the Industrial Revolution are going to have to leave Europe in a lot of ways and find new places to live. Also, a lot of the people that are going to be moving to like the United States or other things are going to have some sort of trade. So they're either going to be farmers or artisanal work, like they make or craft things. And that's not necessary in a lot of the new urban environments that are created because of the Industrial Revolution. So, thus, with a lack of the type of jobs that they're really capable of doing, they need to find some place that will actually give that to them. Some pull factors, though, would be things that are maybe bringing them to like the United States. So, why did they head to the United States rather than Africa or China or Southeast Asia? Well, the pull factors generally go for like a demand of labor. The United States is a new fledgling country, and there is a huge demand for labor in what they are going to kind of refer to as the second industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution is booming in the United States, and there's a huge demand for work. So a lot of people move because of that. Also, the United States is actually an opportunity for more land. So if you don't own land in Europe, if you were to head to the United States, it was pretty likely that you could set up a homestead or a place where your family can live. And so communities of various people throughout Europe are going to find themselves in the United States and are going to make a life for themselves there. Finally, there's just kind of cheap transportation. Steamship, railroads, those kinds of things are going to allow for people once they reach the United States to go into the interior where there are going to be these other opportunities. Obviously, when you think about U.S. history, you're thinking about things like the Trans-American Railway, Transcontinental Railway. All right, that would be a really, really good example. Or steamships on the Mississippi, and it's going to allow for communities to be set up everywhere. So examples of this that we can kind of look around here in Iowa. Iowa is going to be one of the locations or final settling places for a lot of these various migratory movements. There are many different German communities, Polish communities. There's also Dutch communities. Just lots of different European peoples are finding and making their way here in Iowa as kind of their final spot. A lot of these communities or small towns are going to be agricultural in nature because a lot of the people that are moving to the United States were agricultural workers. And so they kind of find a new place to set up farms in the way that was maybe more similar to back in Europe. In fact, actually up until really about 1914, there were many actual German newspapers in Iowa that were, I guess, in full use. And it wasn't until World War I that a lot of those began to wane. But there were many, many different Nordic, German, Dutch languages that were spoke in Iowa for a very long time as a result of a lot of these mass migrations. In total, that means the United States actually gets a lion's share of the immigration. The United States gets labeled roughly, is going to actually receive roughly about 32% of all European immigration. Many of these people, though, are going to be labeled as simply un-American, which is something that we'll just kind of quickly talk about as we kind of move on. What are kind of some of the effects of all of this mass migration? Well, I have a really, really good example for you. So the issue that we can kind of talk about is the Irish issue that came up in American history in the 1800s. There's actually a very, very famous quote that states that the United States should build a giant brass wall around the American heartland, is how it's kind of stated. That particular comment was made by a Supreme Court justice. And that quote is actually aimed at Irish. So even in the 1800s, the Irish were the group that people wanted to keep out, and many people actually talked about, building a wall. Sounds kind of familiar. Now, the reason that we can kind of talk about this and why people came in such large quantities from Ireland is because in 1840s there was an Irish potato famine. Most people are familiar with the fact that this particular event occurred, but it was something that affected a large number of people, and people were starving. People were going hungry. So most were looking for any opportunity to leave Ireland, and many of them came to the United States. Most of these people are going to settle in cities. So a lot of them are going to kind of find themselves in urban environments like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and they're going to work in the factories and basically take up a good portion of the lower class. Most of the time, they did jobs that people just simply didn't want to do. So these low-class jobs for very, very low pay ended up being filled with Irish. Now, because of these low-class jobs that are being taken up by Irish, because they're willing to take virtually anything, a large portion of the Irish cause slums to pop up because they're moving in such large quantities to these cities that the areas that they end up living become, slums. And because these slums are becoming quite large, Americans usually blame the Irish for all of the problems that happen with the new urban environment. So diseases like typhoid, that's an Irish disease. And there's all these Irish prostitutes and alcohol abuse amongst the Irish. All of these things are not necessarily relating to Irish. They're relating to the effects of the Industrial Revolution. But because this group is coming in, they get scapegoated because of a lot of these problems. Also, the Irish were Catholic. Most Americans at this time are going to be Protestant. They follow a different type of Christianity, and so these new Catholic Irish coming in are going to kind of be seen as a threat to the United States culture. So what ends up happening is like there are movements against certain groups of people, these new immigrants. So the Know Nothing movement is actually a very strong anti-Irish and anti-immigration movement that starts in the 1850s. The whole point of this movement was to purify America, to basically, I guess a good way to look at it is that their whole slogan was they wanted to make America great again. And so basically, they stated that the country belongs to the nativists, the people that had always been there. Now, of course, they themselves were also immigrants, if we were to kind of look at it that way. But in 1850, this movement was starting to gain a speed. So if you kind of look at the picture here in the corner, it says, "Natives of the soil, arouse! Shall American labor be protected against foreign competition in this market?" And it's all talking about this concept of nativism, that people coming in from the outside are taking good American jobs and are generally kind of seen as being bad. It's amazing how history repeats itself. All right. So the Know Nothing movement is going to be kind of one of these reactions, this social consequence of a lot of the immigration. Here's another really good one. It says, grocery cart and harness. In good order, one chestnut horse, 8 years old, excellent saddle horse, can be ridden by a lady. I don't know why that's needed. Also, young man wanted from 16 to 18 years of age, able to work, no Irish, need apply. So already there's this kind of connotation that there's like kind of this racial component that ends up being kind of a symptom of a lot of the immigration that happens after the Industrial Revolution. And this is a really, really good example. Or this. Yeah, this is definitely something that, well, that's really terrible. All right, this is from Harper's Weekly, the Journal of Civilization. So this would have been the front cover of this particular magazine. So you can see here there are two individuals here. All right. You're going to notice that their features are going to be highly caricaturized and kind of made to look almost apish or unintelligent. So you can see up here, all right, it's kind of hard to see maybe on your computer, north and south. So what it's kind of saying is that the black population right here is on equal footing as the Irish in the north. So what it's saying is that the Irish and the African American are actually on the same level and should be treated the same, roughly about the 1870s, 1860s. Well, as you kind of know maybe about your, some history, that's a pretty bad thing to say, especially when we think about how African Americans were treated right after the Civil War and during the Civil War. So that's really going to kind of speak to the fact of just like, in fact, that Irish are treated so poorly. And it's a result of all of this immigration. Here's another really good one. If you kind of look at the very bottom here, it says the Irish Declaration of Independence that we are all familiar with. So this is actually going to be an image from a magazine that also dictates just like the various types of behavior that people had kind of stereotyped Irish people as having, right? So you can see here that this woman, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like Germanic looking, right? Kind of like begging and pleading with this big oafish Irish woman right here who is always constantly just declaring that she's not going to work and she's not going to help. Well, this is going to be what really is going to stereotype the Irish during the 1800s. And it's really kind of hard for us to think of that because we always kind of imagine that there's like a stronger, almost like skin color or racial component that comes with kind of stereotyping people. But in reality, during the 1800s, the Irish were treated just as bad as some of the groups that get treated today. And so it's interesting to see how history just, even in really negative ways, ends up repeating itself relatively frequently. Well, that's just a little brief lesson that I was going to give regarding this material. You have a couple of other things that I want you to work on that are also included along with this presentation. Excellent. Thank you.